This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter, Chairman of NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member. And once again, it's my pleasure to have my co-host, Scott Cutler, who's the EVP with the NYSE Euronext. Welcome, Scott.
Great to be back.
Well, we, whenever it's just you and I, we sort of take on these issues that make a lot of people uncomfortable to talk about.
The meat of governance.
Yes, and that is no exception today, because today we're going to talk about when shareholders vote go and the board says no. And what I mean by that is, obviously, we have board elections, and a lot of people have moved to annual elections. You still see some classified boards. You still see some have majority voting, some have plurality voting. So we have a lot of situations out there. But there is, at a lot of companies, the governance guidelines that if somebody does not meet majority of the shareholder support in the elections, that they will submit their resignation to the board. All that's good, except that we have seen occasions where the boards have rejected those submissions of resignation, and even though the shareholder has wanted a director off, the board has not followed through with that. So just to give you a little context to this, I think last year there was probably about 175 directors that fell into that category, and only about 5% of them, of that 175, actually were moved off the board.
Right.
So now, hearing that would raise the hackles on a lot of the hair on the back of their head, but the fact of the matter is that about 90% of that total was small or mid-cap companies, almost all of whom had plurality voting, which means that you only have to get one positive vote to be reelected. So even though the shareholders didn't want them on, the companies were very comfortable because under their guidelines they were accepted to be
Right.
a part of that. That is not true with anybody that has majority voting, because in that case, you will have that come in. You do have to submit that, and you're on record that you did not get a majority of the vote. So shareholders, when boards of directors make the choice to not accept those resignations, there is probably nothing that makes shareholders more sort of emotional than that situation. And pretty well you can count on, in the next year's elections, that proxy advisory firms, large institutional shareholders, will withhold votes or vote no on the election of directors. So that's our topic, and I'm going to start by letting you...
Wow, that's a long lead-in.
Yeah, but I'm going to let you describe how you feel about this particular issue.
Well, it's not a matter of what I feel. I do think it's important that we frame it with a couple of other facts where, as you properly noted, 85% of the S&P 500 have adopted majority voting. If you looked at the S&P 400, you go down to 47%, and when you extend it to the S&P 600, you get down to 25%. So clearly, smaller to mid-ish cap companies, controlled companies, have not uniformly adopted majority voting, as have the large S&P companies, as a fact. This is an issue also very much tied to majority voting in general, which isn't new. I've been around for several years, and clearly from a shareholder's perspective is the governance structure that most pension funds are asking for today and proposing. That's also nothing new. And so, but nonetheless, whatever provision you have, whether it's the requirement of majority voting, or in the situation that you described, which is a modified plurality, which is, hey, you tender the resignation, and then we as a board can accept or reject that resignation. A board really is required in this day and age, if it's a strategic focus of the board, to communicate with your shareholders. And that is understanding the issues. When feedback is given, or when you know in advance that the shareholders are going to have an issue, or even in the event that one of the proxy advisory firms might recommend a withhold vote of a particular director, a company has to be able to respond to that and has to be able to communicate with shareholders well in advance of that time period. And so I think, number one, this is a communications issue. And boards, I think, should feel obligated to establish that dialogue, communicate early and often, and then be responsive. And that responsiveness, I'm not suggesting that has to always take a shareholder recommendation. But I think you do have to be able to respond to that. And again, if the focus and intention and, in fact, the responsibility of the board is to create long-term shareholder value, one has to understand and appreciate shareholder interests. Is that long-term, short-term? What's in the best interest of that solution? And then the board is in the best position to follow that recommendation or not. But I don't think it's dispositive that if they didn't get a majority that one would have to, resign. I think there's a lot of reasons today that might factor into a board, considering that. But it does surprise me, the numbers, that only 5 out of 175 ended up leaving. That feels low, but again, it's going to be a case-by-case situation.
Yeah, and that 5% was directly related to the vote. So
right.
There's some that retire, and there's some
right.
that have other methods to that as well.
Right. What's your feeling on the issue?
Well, first of all, while it's a very emotional issue, it is really a minute issue. The number of companies or directors that really get involved in this, that are in this situation, is small. Okay, so we don't come across it very often. The ones that we do are very well publicized. Okay, but we don't come across it very often. You have to acknowledge that the shareholder power has increased. I mean, the changes to annual elections, majority voting, say on pay. I mean, it's
without question.
Yeah, I mean, you can't go back and say this is how we've done it before. It's a new world, and it gets to your point about communications. How many times on this show have we talked about shareholder communications? I'm almost
it's the oft-repeated phrase.
Yeah. At the same time, we have been, just so that we can be consistent, we have been consistent that it's tough to put one size fits all. So to say that directors must leave, when this happens, there are all kinds of variables, and I'll segue into one in a second here, but there's all kinds of variables of why you wouldn't want something hard and fast. Just like we talk about chairman, CEO roles, just like mandatory retirement. There's a lot of things that I think have to factor in to somebody. Not that you shouldn't have the guidelines, but it's just not that easy. And last thing I'll say is, I think in a majority of cases, directors know whether this is the right thing or not when that happens. They know whether this was a legitimate vote and they need to honor this, or whether this is really a mistake. Like you said, a whole group have been withheld for a goofy reason, and it bumped somebody out that shouldn't have been bumped.
Look, if this becomes the focus of shareholders and investors in a company, a lot of directors today are essentially reaching the conclusion that, look, this shouldn't be the focus of the dialogue. If I am the focus of the dialogue, you have to be able to step back and say, look, this is not a political election. Hopefully you're not positioned in, sort of embedded in terms of the need and the power for having and maintaining that position. And you have to be responsive. This isn't a popularity contest as well, but you do have to be able to listen. And that to me is the biggest issue.
Well, let me give you one of the perfect examples of why I would be sensitive to making it hard and fast. And I don't mean this isn't a discussion about the accuracy of the proxy advisory firms, but there are certainly documented cases where information out there has been correct. Now imagine having a director getting negative votes based on information that wasn't correct. Well, if I'm sitting on that board, there is no way, if I know that information, that I'm not going to speak up and communicate to the shareholder group that, listen, we view this as wrong. This is, we think we have support for that.
Right.
There's no way we're going to want to lose a good director under, misinformation. So,
yeah, I mean, but again, in that case, understanding your shareholders and establishing a dialogue with the proxy advisory firms is a sort of another facet of that communication, because you have to be able to respond in a timely fashion, hopefully. And one of the things we've identified in the inherent conflict with the advisory firms, and we're seeing a slight change of practice now, is that ability to comment and respond. And if you do set up a system where the conclusion is reached and it's not based on the right information, well, shareholders shouldn't be dumb enough to follow that recommendation either.
Right.
And that's an important point to note.
Well, it's interesting when I'm looking here at the most common reasons for withholding support. The number one reason percentage-wise is poison pill without seeking shareholder approval.
Right.
So if you don't know that today, I mean, then maybe you need a temperature check. Attendance is another best practice issue, and both you and I would agree if somebody's not attending, that is a problem.
Right.
Okay. And then related party transactions, again, red flag, and overboarding, which we just talked about just the other day on dealing with that issue. In the company-specific area, comp's about 7%. Say on pay has not had a huge effect, but general shareholder dissatisfaction is 18%. That I understand, because none of these other categories relate to performance or earnings. I'm assuming that general shareholder dissatisfaction means performance.
Yeah, but I think one important thing to note, now those are all reasons why a director or a recommendation could be put forth to withhold a vote for a director or a set of directors. And I think it's important, again, to sort of note that, that link, that there's lots of different things that one would take into consideration in that withhold vote. And that's why that communication issue becomes even more important.
Here we are, back on shareholder communication. Well, when you look at this whole issue, again, we've already identified that it's a very emotional, but it's not a big issue. But what is your feeling as we look at down the road a little bit, and you see these other companies having pressure to do annual elections, declassify boards and accept majority voting?
Yeah. Well, two things. You're on the proxy advisory firm side, which tends to be a big issue. If directors are not responding to issues, they're going to get a withhold vote. And that's going to be a factor that goes into a recommendation for election of directors now going forward from the proxy advisory firms. So simply stated, you don't listen or you don't respond to various issues, the likelihood of getting a withhold vote on a director election goes up. One thing. And then secondly, I said it early, the trend towards majority voting, or the pressure to adopt majority voting provisions, is only going to continue to increase, particularly as that pendulum has swung towards the shareholder, or responding to the shareholder. And that's a trend that companies now, smaller companies, mid-cap companies, controlled companies, are going to need to be responsive or be able to address that pressure in different ways.
Well, there's one thing we do know. Even though this doesn't happen a lot, whenever it happens, it will be very well publicized.
Right.
Yeah, that we know just on all occurrences that happen in the boardroom. So, Scott, I'm not sure we necessarily solved anything, but this is an issue I think that boards need to be sensitive to, and hopefully we've provided some insight into that. And that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you'll join us next week when we'll take a look at another topic that will help you be a better board member or committee member. And we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.